Welcome back to the FinsFocus podcast. We're back. It's been a while, so apologies for that, but we are back. And the Dolphins have made some interesting moves lately, and we're going to talk about them. Obviously, the Super Bowl is coming up. So Tyler, how are you feeling about the Super Bowl? And then we'll get into the other stuff later.
Doing good. As for the Super Bowl, I'm excited. I think that this is showing the two philosophies in team building. It is get your quarterback and then, just let everything else figure itself out on offense. And that's what you can do when you have a Patrick Mahomes type. I know they have Travis Kelce, but their number one weapon outside of him right now is Rashee Rice. And that's crazy to see that got a team to a Super Bowl. No disrespect to Rashee Rice, but that's just it's crazy to see how Patrick Mahomes elevates his weapons. And then you have the 49ers who have Brock Purdy at quarterback, who was Mr. Irrelevant in his draft. And then you've got the four greatest skill position players assembled ever. And then you also have Trent Williams. So it's give your quarterback, draft a guy who needs help and get him every possible weapon he could ever ask for, or draft the greatest quarterback of all time and give him just a number of weapons that he can kind of just get the ball to and let create with yak scenarios. I think it's going to be a really fun game. And, I'm really excited for it. But as for the Dolphins, they made a defensive coordinator move. That's exciting. I'm really excited to talk about that. And that's mainly what this episode's going to be about. So how you doing?
Doing pretty good. I'm obviously excited for the Super Bowl as well. Honestly, I do kind of want the Chiefs to win. I feel like they've become the Patriots where everyone wants to see the 49ers take down the Dragon. But to me, I do want to see Mahomes challenge for the GOAT title, and he needs to win rings to do that. So I think it'd be fun. Shout out to Rashee Rice, though. I love that guy. He won me a couple fantasy things. So shout out to Rashee Rice. He was awesome. And I can't believe he is the number one option on a Super Bowl potentially winning team, but that's where we are. The Dolphins have made a bunch of moves, or not a bunch, but they made one move particularly that's super important. That's going to be the basis of this episode. And Tyler's done a bunch of research, and he's going to kind of give us some in-depth research on Anthony Weaver, who has just been hired as offensive coordinator. And before we even get into that, I actually do think it's important that part of this episode we dedicate to Vic Fangio being let go or mutually parting ways, however you want to describe it. He's not a part of the organization anymore. But that was, I don't know if I would call it surprising just because the season went the way it did, but Vic Fangio gets let go, and we'll start there.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at all the accounts of the Vic Fangio situation, they seemingly only get worse. And you hear about the fact that Vic Fangio pretty much had no desire to let any of his assistant coaches do any of the work and give their input. He would pretty much take whatever research they'd done, try to put together his own approach, which is old school, and they didn't like that. And you hear the fact that, Mike McDaniel's looking for a more collaborative approach, which is something Albert Breer put in a tweet, and Albert Breer put that whole thing about the assistant coaches in his article. And you pretty much hear that Vic Fangio wanted things done his way and was unwilling to change, and that's what you saw on the football field. This team looked almost the exact same on defense the entire year. I would argue players got more accustomed to the system and were making plays by the end of the season, and some guys got healthy at midseason, which was great, like Jalen Ramsey. That really helped this defense because they desperately needed him. But there were a lot of things that just didn't change. Miami was getting destroyed by shallow crossers the entire year. They failed to make changes in the nickel. Kader Kohu, who was, as great as he was in his rookie year, simply not a scheme fit for a Vic Fangio defense, and they continued to run him out as that nickel apex defender over and over and over again, and that ended up biting them. And they were just the entire year in really bad scenarios. Nothing changed, and it was very clear that Mike McDaniel wanted a change and somebody that he could be more collaborative with. And hopefully, based on some of the research I've done, Anthony Weaver can be that guy. What was your take on Fangio being let go? What do you think of that? And pretty much what you asked me. What do you think of Fangio?
Well, for me, it was just, again, I wasn't shocked or anything. I think a lot of people from other organizations or non-Dolphins fans were like, oh my God, they fired him. Whereas when you're kind of a fan of the team and you're locked in, it wasn't as surprising, just considering you paid him the most that any defensive coordinator had ever made in history up to that point. And, he just didn't perform that. Obviously, there were so many injuries on the defensive line and in the defensive backfield, but to me, it just wasn't worth that. And then also, clearly, there was just a fundamental disagreement between the way that Vic Fangio and Mike McDaniel wanted to run the organization, and obviously specifically the defense, which is a part of the team, part of the team that Mike McDaniel is head coaching. And we'll get into that. I think that's a perfect transition, is like you're hiring Anthony Weaver, and the first thing that Mike McDaniel said is he's excited to have a collaborative approach to the way that they want to go about building the defense and building the team, and how player development is the way you build sustained success and all those types of things. Like, clearly Anthony Weaver is coming to be collaborative and to talk with Mike McDaniel, whereas Vic Fangio, again, like a part of like this whole falling out with the Miami Dolphins and part of this whole process of how we got here to hiring Anthony Weaver, is it came out like he was super stubborn, and a lot of people didn't like the way that he coached, and it was super old school. And like, yeah, there's a place for that. I definitely think there's a time for, you know, players to be kind of put in their place and to not just be having fun all the time. But the way that the whole league is now, the way that sports are now across all sports, coaches need to be able to relate to the players and be a player's coach, quote unquote. Like, you have to be able to motivate them more than coach them in a way. You're not as much of a, you know, they're not as much looking up to you. It's like you're kind of coaching with them nowadays, I feel like. So I think Anthony Weaver's going to fit that more. So that's kind of what my thought process was on the Fangio firing. Like, I wasn't like upset about it or like, oh my God, like what are we going to do now type of thing. It was more just, I kind of like what they said, like it's a mutual parting of the ways. There was clearly an ideological difference in the way that they want to run the team and the defense. So that's kind of how we got here. But
real quick, one last word on Fangio from me. I think that this marks the true beginning. I mean, not even necessarily beginning of the end. I think that this marks the true death of the Fangio defense as the meta in the NFL. And I think that's why you saw so many people shocked on Twitter when Vic Fangio got fired. I think that this not working in Miami is the true last straw, and you might be an Eagles fan and think that that's, you know, blasphemous because you just got Fangio. But look at the amount of Fangio guys that just got wiped out over the last week. Sean Desai, you know, he got fired earlier in the season from Philly. Moved around earlier in the season from Philly. Fangio himself gets let go. Brandon Staley gets let go. All of these disciples, you're seeing the same problems over and over again with their defense, and you're seeing that these guys are traditionally stubborn. They want to stick with their stuff and what works, and it's naturally an extremely conservative defense, and we're in the era where a lot of these really great quarterbacks are just going to sit back and pick you apart. Patrick Mahomes is not what he was when the Fangio defense worked against him. When it worked, Patrick Mahomes was trigger happy, would take the ball and just chuck it down the field every play and try to make something happen. He's not that quarterback anymore. The Chiefs are in the Super Bowl because Patrick Mahomes is dinking and dunking at a level that nobody else in the NFL can right now, because he's not only the best traits quarterback in the league, he's the smartest quarterback in the league right now. And a lot of quarterbacks are moving in that direction, which means that your defenses have to become more aggressive to try to force these guys into mistakes. And the Fangio defense did not do that. I think when, you know, Vic Fangio first arrived here, we heard things like, oh, he's cooking up some new defenses he's really excited to try. I don't think we saw those all year. I don't think we saw anything that was really outside of what Fangio typically does all year. It was a ton of quarters, a ton of too high stuff, and a ton of the same things Fangio defenses get beat by. Underneath passes, stacks, and putting defenders in conflict. Absolutely torching the nickel position no matter who was on the field. These are the kind of things you just couldn't stick with, and I think this marks Miami hopefully moving into a new era of defensive football. And I truly think either way, even if this Anthony Weaver hire works or not, you're just looking at truly, in my opinion, the death of the Fangio defense as the meta in the NFL.
I mean, yeah, you talk about elite quarterbacks dicing it up. I mean, when Will Levis is doing it, I mean, that pretty much marks the death of that defense. I agree with you.
Any patient quarterback at all, patient quarterback is torching this defense.
100%, because you're not blitzing really, unless he likes to call it, oh, I like to blitz when we want to, not when we need to. But it's like, sometimes you need to, man. These quarterbacks are freaks. But regardless, fortunately for us, you know, we have a new guy who, you know, he a part of, again, like his initial, like when we've done research on him, Tyler's done a lot more research than me, but even when I've done a little bit of research on him, it's a lot. And obviously a lot of this is going on or is going with what you kind of learn from, or what I've learned from doing research on Mike Macdonald. But it's all about being multiple and adapting to the situation, which is what you want to see, because that's what the NFL is now. You can't have this strict, stubborn game plan that like Fangio had. We're going to kind of do the same thing against all these different teams and all these different specific players and all these different specific skill guys, and expect something and expect a different result every time. Like that's generally the actual definition of insane. Like you can't do that. That's not how the NFL works anymore. You have to be multiple. You have to be adaptable, and you have to adapt to what the other team is showing you. And like we saw when Kader Kohou was matched up against Stephon Diggs in the first half and got torched for however many yards and however many touchdowns, and coming in the second half, he decides to stay with the same thing. It's like you have to learn to adapt, and you have to learn to be multiple on defense. So that brings us to where we want to get to, which is Anthony Weaver, who he is as a defensive coordinator and what he's going to bring to this Miami Dolphins team.
Yeah. Anthony Weaver, obviously, you brought it up. I think the first thing that we should bring up is we're in a modern era of the league where players aren't necessarily looking at coaches like the be all end all. You want somebody you can relate to, and I think that the big thing that Anthony Weaver happens to have is he was a former player, drafted in 2002, played for the Ravens, and him coming back was kind of a big deal. He had a whole press conference, multiple interviews about how excited he was to come back. And that's the thing. He is a former player. He played linebacker in this league, and he's somebody who naturally relates to players. He was quoted in Houston. I found an interview where he was talking about, the same kind of things that Mike McDaniel talks about, that these players' careers are finite, and that every game is very important to them. And you might be talking about the fact that they're not winning and not executing, but these are players that it's up to the coaches to make sure that these guys are maximized and that you're working individually with them. And that's something that Mike McDaniel was really excited about. He called him a leader of men in Mike McDaniel's little blurb that he put out once Weaver got hired. He said he's excited about him as a leader of men. And he said that he shares our belief that player development is the cornerstone to both team building and sustained excellence, which is just something that I think you want a guy that players can appreciate. Yeah, exactly. You want a guy that players can appreciate, and it was clear that Vic Fangio had lost the locker room. A quote from Albert Breer said that Vic Fangio's sort of approach was, quote, decidedly old school and seeped through the players who, by the end of the season, started to tune Fangio out. And it's clear. These guys did not like having a guy that they just simply could not relate to, did not feel that was, tailoring to each of their skill sets, and was doing this thing where it was like, I'm going to run what I'm going to run, and you guys are just going to do my bidding. You're going to do this job. It seems like Anthony Weaver is going to be a different guy. And I think that's the biggest thing is Mike McDaniel wanted that collaborative approach, which is the tweet that you're going to hear those two words a billion times this offseason, because it's the tweet from Albert Breer where he said that there were philosophical differences, and that's where he first heard collaborative approach. Mike McDaniel talks about how excited he is to work with this guy. You're going to hear those two words a ton this offseason, and that's the hope, is that you're seeing players, assistant coaches, Mike McDaniel himself, all gelling to this guy and having one cohesive vision.
100%. And that's, again, like, it's kind of reminiscent of when you went from Brian Flores to Mike McDaniel, in the sense that you're going away from this ideological change where you want someone who is going to be collaborative, and it's not going to be his way or no way. This is like a complete transformation from that regime. Obviously, after Flores left, he retained Boyer. Then obviously we went to Fangio, but now we have Weaver, and it just, again, like we've said, and you're going to hear it a bunch, it's like a completely different like ideological way of building a team, and they both agree, and I agree obviously with it too, is like the best way to get your team and your players to play, or the best way to have team success is for your players to have their own success, and the way you do that is by helping them become their best selves, which is what Mike McDaniel loves to do. And when obviously we've talked about it before, and I'm sure you've heard it a million times, when Mike McDaniel was initially hired, all you saw was how much players relate to him and want to play their best for him and want to play the best because of him, because development is such a big part of the NFL and such a big part of sustained success. I mean, look at the two teams in the Super Bowl right now. That tells you everything you kind of need to know. But I'm really excited to have Anthony Weaver join as defensive coordinator. We're going to get into kind of what he's going to run and all that stuff later. But to be fair, it's kind of hard to dictate what that's going to be at this point in time. We're recording on February 9th, so keep that in mind if you're listening to this at any point later. But I'm just excited to see that there is this change to this more modern style and modern approach to coaching, because that is what has been breeding success in the NFL recently, which gives me confidence. Now, obviously, I was very excited about Vic Fangio when he was first brought in as well, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think that's just kind of how you have to approach things nowadays. And we had to go through that experience of having Fangio to learn that maybe that's not the way we want to go. And especially with Mike McDaniel as your head coach, it's not like he's some old school or he's not some like old school like Bill Belichick type of guy where he's going to do it that way. It's like with Mike McDaniel, you want a guy who's going to be collaborative, because obviously if you have a guy like Vic Fangio, they're going to not kind of work together, which is what you need from your head coach and defensive coordinator, especially when a head coach is offensive oriented.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's really important here is it very much seems like Mike McDaniel wants to be tested. I think he wants a guy who's willing to say, "Hey, I don't like what you're thinking about this. We're going to do this." And I think he likes that chess match. Like, I think he wants one cohesive unit with a vision. You saw it during Hard Knocks. Him and Butch Berry are the first two guys in every morning, and they're talking out their things. And Butch Berry's a hard-headed guy and somebody who, is very tough on his players, but he's in there talking to Mike McDaniel, like walking him through stuff and things that he sees on tape. I think Mike McDaniel very much likes to be tested. You heard it in the interviews before the Chargers game that he was very much bouncing things off Ronaldo Hill, and I think that's a big part of why the Chargers game plan was the best game plan we'd seen all season, even though it was in week 1, was that Mike McDaniel was being tested, and he was like, if I do this, what are you going to do? And there was this chess match going back and forth because him and guys like Ronaldo Hill, who were on the staff and were on that Chargers staff last year, were kind of giving him different pieces of information. And I think that's something that really excites me, is the creative aspect to it all, and the fact that Anthony Weaver is a guy who in interviews has talked about how excited he was to be with the Ravens because he loved that they had one vision and everybody was working together to get that done. And that another thing that's always been a part of Anthony Weaver's ideology is creativity and finding answers. And that's the same thing you hear Mike McDaniel talk about all the time. He always talks about how creating an offense is problem solving. We don't have the cheat motion or the short motion, whatever you want to call it, without problem solving. And I think if you want to see innovation, you need a guy who's willing to change things and switch things up, and Fangio wasn't that guy. And the hope is Anthony Weaver is. I have a quote from him here from when he was in Houston. He said, quote, "The creative part of defensive scheming is one of my favorite parts about the job. You got to love the chess match and trying to put the pieces in the right place and get free runners and hit the quarterback and do all those things. That's part of the beauty in schematics." That's a quote from Weaver. I think he's clearly a guy who just wants to see what things work, test different stuff, and be that. If you're going to do this, I'm going to do that. And I think Mike McDaniel wants that kind of guy that he can game plan with throughout the week, who's truly going to give him tests that he can use come game time, because I wouldn't be shocked if that whole collaborative approach thing also had to do with the fact that Vic Fangio was not giving much innovative, material to work with.
Yeah, Vic Fangio, this is not sourced or anything, but he just seems like a guy who likes to be by himself. Like, he was in the booth, he likes to be by himself, do his own thing, and just kind of, again, do it his own way. And that was obviously, again, all the reports after, where he was not letting his coaches kind of coach in a way. He was just saying, do your stuff positionally, but then I'll do everything else. But getting into Anthony Weaver, and you talked about schematics, we'll get into that. In February 2012, he was hired by the New York Jets as their assistant defensive line coach under Rex Ryan. Then 2013, he was hired by the Buffalo Bills as their defensive line coach under Doug Marrone. Then in 2016, like Tyler mentioned, he was hired by the Houston Texans as their defensive line coach under Bill O'Brien. And then on January 22nd, 2021, Weaver was hired by the Baltimore Ravens as their defensive line coach and run game coordinator, and was promoted to assistant head coach the next year. This is all important because obviously now as our defensive coordinator, he has taken things from all those head coaches that he worked under, and obviously Mike McDonald last year as a defensive coordinator for Baltimore. He's worked with them, and it's all going to kind of co-inspire into whatever he's going to create as his defense. Preliminary research suggests he likes to blitz, but I don't know if that's going to be the way, because he's learned under so many different people. We'll have to see, because this is really his first time calling the shots for real. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with that. But learning under guys like Rex Ryan, Bill O'Brien, under Mike McDonald, who love to be multiple, love to send different guys and send heat, it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of that. But as a guy who's played, and as a guy who kind of understands, again, that whole approach of what we were talking about earlier, being adaptable, being multiple, I think you're going to see a bunch of different things from him. But schematically, it does seem like we'll probably stick in the 3-4. That's just a personnel thing. You would assume he'd stick in the 3-4. That's what the Ravens did. That's just probably what's going to happen. And then obviously Mike McDonald was running a bunch of the, honestly, zone coverage has been very, it's very similar across the board, just when you're kind of using which coverage that coaches like to kind of defer into. But it's a lot of cover 6, cover, all that stuff, cover 2. So it's going to be very interesting to see, but we won't know until we know. But I'm hoping Tyler will have a little bit of information on that.
Yeah, the one thing that has followed Anthony Weaver wherever he's gone is blitzing and simulated pressure creative looks. And like you said, he came up under Rex Ryan in 2012, which, Rex Ryan is known for his amoeba fronts, different exotic blitz packages. That's what Rex was. He was live and die by the fire. He was in, Buffalo. He was in Cleveland for a couple of years, actually with Mike McDaniel, I believe, on that staff. And he was the Texans D-line coach in 2016 to 2019. And this is where it gets interesting, because that's when DJ Reader was coming up. And that's when DJ Reader really became a 3-down player. And then he went to Cincy. He became one of the best defensive tackles in the league. And this is where you start to see less of the schematic standpoint and more so, the player development. He was the Texans DC in 2020. Obviously, that defense was horrible, but they were 7th in blitz rate, which is really interesting. How much of that is schematics in that's what you want to do? And how much is the fact that Texans personnel was, one of the worst defensive personnel groups in the league? Their defensive line was bad. Their secondary was bad. And those are 2 problems Miami hopefully should not have last season. So you don't really know where it's going to fit in. But yeah, blitzing has followed him everywhere he's gone. Blitzing, simulated pressures, just being a guy who likes to find lanes and hit the quarterback, like he said in the quote that I mentioned earlier. But I think the 2 things that you can kind of see coming are the fact that he has developed guys on the defensive line. These last couple of years, he was there for Travis Jones, Justin Madubuike, who just had one of the best interior defensive line seasons of anyone in the league. He was the defensive line coach of the Ravens this last year, and that's where he saw those 2 guys. Michael Pierce has had a resurgence and is a guy I know you love. DJ Reader, when he was in Houston. Interior defensive linemen develop under Anthony Weaver. That is a thing that happens. And the other thing, like I said, certainty almost, is blitzing. He loves to send these blitzes and creative pressure looks. He's been known for it his entire career, so I certainly think you're going to see some of it. Like you said, it's really hard to tell what individual coverages you're going to see or how he's going to base his defense, because everywhere he's gone, it's been different. And in Houston, there was some too high stuff, but that defense, again, is he just playing to the strengths of his players? Even if that's what he believed philosophically back then, that was 2020, that was it will be 5 years ago by the time he's coaching for Miami. It'll be 4 or 5 seasons removed.
Half decade.
So it's really, yeah, exactly. It'll be very much removed from what he actually does. So yeah, like I said, the mainstays are going to be the fact that he's probably going to bring in some interior defensive linemen with the hopes of developing those kind of guys, because he is such a great development guy when it comes to those guys. And blitzing has just been his thing no matter where he's gone.
I could definitely see us, this is so random, I could definitely see us drafting a defensive tackle that he just wants to develop and knows what he can get out of. But yes. I was going to say on that note, yeah, I left out the defensive coordinator portion just because, like you said, the personnel was actually so bad to the point where it's what are you even going to take from this? And then also, again, like you said, it's very smart. It's followed him everywhere. He has learned under Rex Ryan, but it's also That was also from 2012. The NFL's changed a lot. He's probably changed a lot. That's why we're not going to be here on this podcast telling you we know what he's going to do. We know he's going to be like, we don't know. We don't know. It's been a long time. It's been however many years since he's even had the chance to call plays in the first place. And that's why I mean, where it's like, this is kind of his first real shot with a real defense to do that. And it's going to be very interesting to see what he can come up with the defensive personnel that we have, because it's going to be super interesting to see which guys go, which guys stay. Because before Fangio got let go, I was still in flux of like, are we bringing back a Christian Wilkins? Are we bringing back, an Andrew Van Ginkel? Are we bringing back a Jerome Baker? Is he getting moved? And now you bring in a whole new kind of system on defense that's going to throw a whole new wrench into the mix, which has us in a place where who knows really which personnel is staying, which is going, and who knows how he's going to want to coach things and do things. And I think a lot of that is going to happen like during training camp, because it's going to be the first time like he has eyes on players. Now, obviously, he can watch film, and he's actually talked about that a lot too in interviews about watching film and doing that sort of thing. But like, I think a lot of him is going to be learning on the fly, learning about these players, what he wants. And obviously, a lot of our positions, I would say, are filled, quote unquote, again, on defense. Like, you have a bunch of guys, but Bradley Chubb might not be ready for the start of the season. So what are you going to do there? Is Xavier Howard coming back? Like, there's so many questions personnel-wise, and you're introducing a new system. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens, because these guys that are here, they've already learned under Boyer, went a completely different scheme change with Fangio, and now you're kind of going somewhere in the middle, you'd assume, with Anthony Weaver.
Yeah, I think this is going to be very, very interesting, because there's just so many guys that it's like, depending on what kind of scheme he brings with him, who's going to be important to that. I mean, I don't know if any of our interior D linemen are necessarily like a perfect fit, but a guy like, Zach Sealer's staying. You doubt Christian Wilkins is staying solely because of money, even though I think his pass rush presence is something that a guy like Weaver likes. I think you're going to be looking for a run-stuffing nose if he's going to be bringing in
Devondre Sweat, baby. That's a big boy.
That's one of them. A Jerzon Newton type. Like, just bringing in somebody who's like a big gap-filling nose. Kind of the opposite of what Flores drafted Raekwon Davis to be. You just want somebody who's big and is more going to stuff gaps rather than try to get like a pass rush type out of them. Kind of like what we saw from Michael Pierce in Baltimore. I think there could be a complete overhaul aside from Zach Sealer on who's going to be on the interior defensive front. As for, so much of this is going to come down to how much of Mike McDonald's Baltimore scheme is he going to bring with him, because that seems to be the wave of where the defenses in the NFL are going. It's so much, blitzing these teams that like to run these condensed formations and just rotating every single coverage you can possibly run. Like the Ravens, a lot of people talk about their defense as a two-high defense or a single-high defense or a man defense. They run everything.
Yeah, they run zone match too. Like
they ran everything this past season. And that's the thing is there are certain staples of that defense that are super important, but I have no idea what the there are certain staples as far as players and how they were used that were so important, but I have no idea how we're going to see like certain coverages run. Are we going to be a cover 2 team, a cover 4 team, a cover 6 team, a man team? The only thing I can tell you is I think we're going to get a lot of blitzing, and I think certain players are going to be really important, and I think that's a perfect time for us to kind of segue into a specific player we both wanted to talk about a bit, in Jevon Holland.
Oh, 100%. So Jevon Holland, obviously coming off a year where, dealt with some injuries, but before the injuries was playing really good ball in a Fangio defense. That wasn't surprising just because safeties are kind of again, it's not like in every other defense they're not, but that's kind of like the main part of the defense. They're so involved in every part of the game and the run game, and they're so involved just because you're not blitzing that much. Anyways, they're super involved.
The thing with Holland is he's also an awesome 2-eye safety.
Yeah, you just get everything.
It was a good fit for him even in that role, playing like someone at a position. He was just in a natural role where he was gonna play well when he was on the field.
No, exactly. Basically, he was really good, and you expect that again with Vic Fangio. The kind of conversation that Tyler is kind of like referring to, which we're going to get into, is we just saw Kyle Hamilton play the way he did in a role that Jevon Holland hasn't played in a long time, but he has had some experience in back in college. And we wanted to talk about how he could be used in this kind of Ravens-esque defense, because like quickly, it's just we really don't know. Like, how much is he taking from back in his day with Rex Ryan? How much is he taking from Mike McDonald? How much is he taking positionally? Like, we already know he's a defensive line guy, so you'd assume that room gets overhauled. What does he think about linebackers? What does he think about cornerbacks and safeties? Like Mike McDaniel might want a specific thing from his corners and safeties. Maybe Anthony Weaver has a different ideological sort of idea when it comes to that. Maybe, for his corners, he likes them to be more press. We'll never know. We'll never know. We don't know yet because, again, this is his first time calling the shots with real talent on his team. So we kind of have to wait for that. But the one thing that we do know is that he just saw Mike McDonald create an absolute defensive Swiss Army knife in Kyle Hamilton, and he was all over the field playing that kind of nickel, almost even that star role, if you want to call it that. He was all over the field. And the question is, can Jevon Holland do that? We know he can. Can he do it to the effectiveness that he's been running this zone kind of too high safety? Because that's where he's been playing since he's gone to the league.
Yeah, this is the thing with Jevon Holland. He, coming out of college, the things that he was best at were two-eye safety and nickel, like big nickel as a slot corner safety hybrid. And the thing is, since he's gotten to the league, he didn't even play his last year in college. So since he's gotten to the league, he played single high under Flores, single high under Boyer, and then this past year, strictly two-eye safety when we really thought he was going to move around, which means that he's 4 or 5 years removed from playing where we thought his natural fit was. That's a half a decade on a guy who's only like 24, 25's life. Things change, but Jevon Holland is such an athlete and such a great player that you really do want to see him in a similar role to a Kyle Hamilton because you think he can succeed. But I think his development is such a key part of this defense, especially if Weaver brings a lot of these Mike McDonald principles that we've seen. I have no idea what's going to happen with a guy like Jevon Holland. That's where it gets really interesting. He hasn't, like I said, he hasn't played what we could expect him to play in 5 years. So expecting a breakout from him is hard. But he's also not just a traditional free safety, and I think that's a spot where you're limiting him. So I think a big thing that we're going to have to watch for this free agency is I have a very strong feeling that this team is going to bring in a third safety. I think Deshaun Elliott, I think the goal should be to bring him back. I think he was really strong when he was healthy and him and Holland were together. I think keeping Deshaun Elliott should be a big key for this defense. Bringing in, keeping Jevon Holland, obviously, because he's going to be on the roster, and bringing in a third safety. And I think the biggest part of that is you're going to see a lot of people talking about that third player they bring in. Is that guy going to be more of a big nickel type like you're seeing, Kyle Hamilton be? And that might be the guy you want to throw in that apex defender role that has kind of swept the National Football League? Or are they going to bring in a more traditional free safety type and let Jevon Holland come down and do some of that work? I think that's the big free agency decision that's going to be very interesting because I think it's going to show just how much faith they have in Jevon Holland to potentially return to that role, or if they want to, be more multiple and try it with somebody else. I think that's a role that needs to be filled, and obviously the logical answer might be Holland, but again, hasn't done it in a half a decade. So it's going to be really, really intriguing to see what they do about it.
By the way, we are not saying that he can't because he has all the athletic traits to do so. It's just the fact that he hasn't, to be clear.
Yeah,
and I know Tyler thinks that too.
He has to relearn a whole new position again.
Yeah, like it's not about him as a person or like he's not smart. Like he is so capable. Like he was a captain. Like he's super smart, super athletic. Like he's everything you want out of a defensive player, especially in the backfield. It's just about the fact that he hasn't done it in a while. And I agree with you that third safety is going to be a huge question. I actually think if you can re-sign Brandon Jones for cheap as a fourth safety, that'd be sick. Just because, again, sending guys like you talked about simulated pressures, like Brandon Jones, like that's the one thing he can do. We know he's not great in coverage. So if you want to bring him back for cheap, I don't know what his market would even be looking like, but that would be nice just because he can blitz, he can get downhill. But that's more of a minor kind of situation. But other than that,
Brandon Jones is for sure a guy I'd bring back, but I think that, like you said, the price has to be right. What were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, what do we think we're going to do with the personnel? Do you have any kind of way you're leaning with any of the key guys that we're kind of choosing whether we want to bring back, or a guy like Xavier Howard who we could move on from, a guy like Jerome Baker who we could move on from, or again, like I said, all the pending free agents?
I think there are a few really interesting spots on this team. And I think the first thing that it's really important to do is I'm making the assumption that some of the Mike McDonald principles are going to come over from Baltimore. I'm just making that assumption only because I have no idea. That's the closest thing he's been around to. And we're at the point where this offseason is only speculation because we have no idea.
And it's where he's had the most success too. So yeah, it makes sense.
And he was the run game coordinator before Mike McDonald got there, and he had specific D-line traits that he liked. Now Mike McDonald's there, and he's seen some things that have worked really well. I'm going to assume that some of those things come over. Like I said, the biggest free agency thing that we need to decide, who's going to be the big nickel or slot guy, or are you going to stick to traditional nickel corner style stuff? I think the three guys that you could see most, I think there are three guys that could play the most nickel snaps for the Dolphins this year. And I think it's Jevon Holland, Kader Kohou if you want to stick to a traditional nickel and not go more big nickel, or a third guy who happens to be in free agency. I think that's the three main options. I don't think you're going to see Ramsey play much of the nickel just because I don't think you're going to be sticking with X, which I guess is something I will move on to. But yeah, I think your three main options are there. I think who you're going to play in the nickel is huge into this next season. Moving on, I think the interior defensive line is a huge need. It's going to be a pressing need because you might only have one guy on the roster from last year who's going to be on the roster this year. Raekwon Davis, I fully expect to be gone. I don't think there's really much of a fit for him because he's a nose tackle who doesn't do any of the things that Anthony Weaver has liked in his nose tackles. He's not a nose that does anything that most of the league likes in his nose tackles because he's a pass rusher and really not much else in the pass.
Unless you're Dexter Lawrence and you're a power rusher from the nose tackle position, you're not going to be that great. So
yeah. He's like a finesse rusher from the nose tackle position, and it just doesn't work. So I think the defensive tackles, it's very key. I think there's going to be a new nose on this team. It will not be Raekwon Davis. I think that we're looking at potentially multiple new pass rush first style guys. Travis Jones and Justin Madubuike were both brought in with pass rush prowess first, and they were honed in on that and became more complete players. I think that's something Weaver can do. Do I have names that necessarily fit that role? Not yet. More in the draft season, I probably will. And then closer to free agency, I'll obviously have some of those names. But I think you could expect Zach Sealer, obviously, still going to be a focal point of this team. He's a really good player. But I think you could see a complete interior defensive line overhaul. So that's two spots. You've got the nickel, the interior defensive line. And my last... I guess there are two more spots. Who's going to be the opposite linebacker opposite David Long? I think that's the guy who's obviously staying. I think his run game presence is phenomenal. He, I think, was in a position where he had to make a lot of guesses in the passing game last year. I don't think he's as bad of a pass defender as Vic Fangio's defense made him out to be, just because of the fact that I don't think he was given a fair shake there, and they were getting obliterated over the middle no matter who was back there. So... David Long, I think, is staying. Does Jerome Baker stay? That's where it gets weird. I don't know if that's the guy you want as your second linebacker, but I also don't know what the options are in free agency. I mean, Patrick Queen is a guy that I know that Weaver has worked with, and we just saw some development from him, but Spotrac has him at $18.5 million annual value. The Dolphins cannot pay him that. It will not happen. If he wants to come here on the low, sure, but he will not be a
on the low
at that value. Yeah, if he wants to come here for a cool less than $10 million, which is less than half of his projected value, sure, but he's not getting paid 10 plus in my opinion from Miami. I mean, if you want to go to a budget guy, I think they need a true pass coverage first guy, and I'm going to, I guess, hard launch this here. Azeez Al-Shaair is going to be a free agent, and that's a guy where I would be heavily in on him.
We're very aligned on this. We are very aligned on this specific.
Yeah, he got 1 year, $5 million, I think, last year. He's going to be a free agent again. He might get, a similar contract, maybe a bit more. And I think even at that value, that guy is a steal and somebody that I want, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of the stuff that Baltimore tried to do with Queen and Roquan Smith, where you had them running back into zones and trying to manipulate guys. You need athletic linebackers who can do a little bit of everything. Azeez Al-Shaair is that guy. And my last spot is who's going to be the number 2 corner, but this was kind of a thing no matter what, because I don't think you're going to keep X solely due to the contract, and I know it's just so much pain because he's done so much for this team and he's been such a great player. But we've gotten to that point where you either have to hope he takes a pay cut, which he says he won't, or move on from him. And I know that you just drafted Cam Smith, and everyone's saying, Fangio's the reason that Cam Smith couldn't play.
He's unlocked now, Tyler. I don't know if you saw on Twitter. He's unlocked.
Sure. I mean, I would love to believe that. And there were a lot of really good man reps from him in training camp. So if you're running a lot more man coverage, that is somewhere I'd like to see him. And I do think that Cam Smith can be a really good football player. But being a team that is trying to fight for the Super Bowl, having a first-year starting corner on the outside, you need to make sure that that is certainly where you're going to go. He needs to be showing that he is not only good, but very good opposite Jalen Ramsey. Because whoever's playing on that opposite side is getting 5 to 10 targets minimum a game, and they need to make sure that those are not 5 for $150 like Kader Kohu on Stephon Diggs. You need to make sure that that's not happening. So those are the kind of 4 main spots. I think you need to figure out what you're going to do in the nickel or in the nickel/free safety spot. Interior defensive line, I think it's an overhaul. I think you bring in one more linebacker, and I think you evaluate where you're at on Cam Smith.
So I'll touch on those things too. I'll start with I'll go kind of backwards from where you went. So I'll start with the second outside corner spot. If you're going with Cam Smith, you're right. You need to see something. If not, you're going to have to hire. Jesus. You're going to have to sign, you're going to have to sign a guy, not Eli Apple, but you're going to have to sign a guy who can kind of play for a couple years or play for a year until Cam Smith can kind of develop into what you think he can do. But it's hard to say, or it's hard to tell him to develop without getting the reps. It's so hard to take a developmental player and put him on a team that's trying to compete, because how are you going to develop him without getting him reps? It's a very interesting conversation, but you're going to have to hire a guy who will be kind of like that bridge guy. Because we to be honest, I'm just kind of going through this out loud. We used a 2nd round pick on him. You'd want to see him get reps. So unless he shows something incredible, and unless Anthony Weaver absolutely loves him, and if he does, hopefully that's great, and he'll be the second corner guy. If not, you'll have to kind of sign a bridge corner. Hopefully someone, again, who's better than Eli Apple. That's kind of my thoughts on that. If not, it's going to be, could be anyone. Again, I'm hoping personally, this is my, just my heart. This is not my brain. My brain knows that he's gone. I'm hoping X can come back, as he was actually not too bad last year. I feel like he's gotten a lot of heat when I was he was pretty, a lot of his stats, by week 12, 13 were very reminiscent of his 2020 year, other than the interceptions, which obviously was a big part of that. But he was averaging a career low, yards per target, yards per reception. It was great. He was playing awesome ball. Part of that could be because he's playing obviously in Fangio's scheme as well. But I'm gonna back my guy no matter what. But with the linebacker position, I think this is the most interesting conversation, because he's under contract. But it's does Anthony Weaver like Jerome Baker? Because Jerome Baker plays well in space. He's not that great at getting downhill. But do you want a guy who's good at playing in space, or do you want a guy who can actually drop back into coverage, which we know Jerome Baker's kind of struggled with when getting his depth. But it's do you keep Jerome Baker? Do you move on from him? But it's also like we've talked about so much. It's it's a thought process. It's a question of money too, because you save $10 million if you move on from him. So it's that can be a very, very valuable $10 million if you're going to go use it on an interior defensive lineman, if you're going to go use it on that second outside corner. So these are all things they're going to talk about. And then it's if you do go to Jerome Baker, though, you have that second linebacker spot. Are you going to go budget hunting with Azeez Al-Shaair? budget hunting? Or are you going to go draft somebody? Are you going to have a first-year linebacker playing aside David Long Jr.? So the Dolphins personnel is all out of whack, and it's a very interesting position. Personally, I don't know. I think if Anthony Weaver likes him, obviously we'll keep him. But if we end up moving on from him, I'm with you. Like Azeez Al-Shaair to me works perfectly, especially in tandem with David Long Jr. I think their skill sets really play off each other well. And I think, again, when it comes to the financial side of things, it might make sense to move on from him. And, also Jerome Baker's been here for a long time, and we're talking about all these changes. Maybe it's time to finally, break the bone and kind of make it a clean cut and move him off the team just because he's been here through so much. But that's obviously an interesting conversation. As for the defensive line, if he can end up bringing us like anyone that he likes, like you talked about, DJ, like who really knows? Personally, I do think that might be a position we look to draft, just because if you use a day 1 or day 2 pick on a defensive lineman, we've seen what this guy can do with developing interior defensive linemen. So why not let him just develop one himself, where you can have him on a rookie contract for that nose tackle position? Like I mentioned, T'Vondre Sweat. That's just because T'Vondre Sweat is a massive human being. Literally, I'm not going to talk about scouting or anything like that yet, but he's just a massive human being, so that'd be really fun. But I think that's a place you can go for that. And then like we already talked about a lot, it's that third safety position, and that's really going to tell you what their that's going to tell you what their idea is to do with Jevon Holland, because like you said, it's so true. If they bring in a too high safety, that probably means Jevon Holland's going to move down into that big nickel role. But if they bring in a big nickel guy, that probably means Jevon Holland's going to play that too high role, which is fine because him and Deshaun Elliott, again, in tandem, were fantastic. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation, because we really, it's a podcast, so it sucks to say, we really just have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think this is my biggest gripe with this Miami Dolphins organization, is that it's very hard to see, especially with Miami's cap situation, a way where they can field 22 good starting football players unless they hit on multiple draft picks. And we're in a weird year where the guys you have to hit on in either free agency or the draft just mirror where you have missed in the past. You need to go get an interior offensive lineman. Liam Eichenberg was a miss, a guy that you drafted in the second round. You need to go get you need to go get an interior defensive lineman. That's where a guy like Raekwon Davis, you drafted 4 years ago, never really became a hit. You need to figure out if you have a corner opposite Jalen Ramsey. You missed on Noah Igbenogany in the first round under Brian Flores, and you don't know if Cam Smith is a hit. You need a linebacker who can swarm and fly to the football. That's where you missed on Channing Tindall. You need a big slot receiver. You have no clue if Eric Ezukama is that guy.
Bring back Elijah Higgins, baby. Woo!
There are so many different spots on this team that are starting to show their cracks, and all of them are because of missed draft picks. And I understand that you cannot hit on 100% of your draft picks, but there were so many times where Miami was aggressive and they needed to hit on guys, especially in that 2020 draft. And you go back and you look through that draft and you're like, Tua, call it a hit, call it a miss. I'm not having that argument. I don't want to gain haters on either side. I like Tua. I don't love him. I don't think he's an elite quarterback, and that's the kind of thing that can plug these holes. You look at Austin Jackson, sure, we can call that a hit now if you want to. I don't care. You move on, Noah Igbenogany, miss. Robert Hunt, hit. Raekwon Davis, a bunt single, if it's a hit. It's not a home run.
A bunt single.
Yeah. You may have snuck
that's
on
like
base.
That's like he got on base like an error. Like he got on base with an error type thing.
Yeah, it's not a hit. He got walked. Yeah. Brandon Jones, another same deal. Like that 2020 draft, you needed guys that could, I feel like consistently produce, and you needed to have one of those like 2017 Saints drafts where it's like Ryan Ramczyk and Alvin Kamara and like everything, and Marshawn Lattimore and everything in between is like an amazing play. Miami needed one of those drafts. And even 2021 where you hit on your first 3 picks in Waddle, Phillips, Holland. After that, you trade up and you go get Liam Eichenberg. It's like they just needed one of these to fall their way, and none of them did. And I think that's exactly where this team is right now, and they're in a weird spot where they have to find a way to field 22 very good football players in order to be a Super Bowl contending team, because anything other than a Super Bowl this year is a flat out failure, because this is the last year that you can pay all these guys on your roster. You might not be looking at a Tyreek Hill or a Jalen Ramsey, or if you even have one more year of Teron Armstead. There are so many guys this year that it is this year or nothing. And I think we're in a situation where you hit on 2 or 3 more of those draft picks, and maybe you feel confident that you can mimic the 49ers.
Oh, 100%.
Right now, you need to scrape the bottom of the barrel, find a bunch of value guys, and then hit on 3 or 4 draft
You need to
picks
find 4 Andrew Van Ginkles is what you need to do. That's what you have to do.
Yeah. You have to scrape the bottom of the barrel in free agency and be like, this guy can play above his value. This guy can play above his value, and do that consistently, which is something Miami hasn't done. And you have to draft 3 or 4 talents who can play and contribute. And Miami just hasn't done either in recent years, especially like in mid to late rounds. I mean, we were just in a situation where they drafted guys in the 6th and 7th round who got cut before they even played a regular season game.
Did you think Elijah Higgins was being mentioned on a defensive coordinator podcast? Wow, what a pull.
Yeah. I mean, that's another, like, there just has to be. There has to be a concerted effort that this is the year that you have to pull it all together, or else it might go down in flames. And that's kind of going to be the theme of this whole offseason, because Miami has set themselves up that they, instead of deciding to go for a rebuild when you hired Mike McDaniel, you said, you know what? We're sticking it out with Tua. We're trading for Tyreek Hill. We're signing Teron Armstead. We're trading for Jalen Ramsey. We're trading for Bradley Chubb. And we're just gonna go all out on the stars and scrubs roster. But what you realize is when you don't have, you know, guys who can cover up other guys' holes in the way that, you know, Tua does, or in the way that like a Patrick Mahomes does. As good as Tua is, he's not a Patrick Mahomes type. Then you need great guys all over the roster, and Miami just doesn't have that right now.
All right, we're getting way too big picture here. Well, we have a lot of the offseason to get to that. We're 51 minutes in. So we'll probably wrap it up there. But on the Elijah Higgins point, who is, and maybe we can make this a segment, who is the most random Miami Dolphins player you can name right now? And maybe we'll just do that every time to end the episode. And it'll be a really fun game.
I'm going to cheat because I saw that he got a head coach job at a high school this morning. Jason Trusnick is my random Miami Dolphin of the day. Somebody retweeted it on my timeline. And former Dolphins linebacker Jason Trusnick he just got named a coach at Strongsville. Do I know where that is? Absolutely not. But that's my random Miami Dolphin of the day. Do you have one?
I'll go more recent just because you went a little more old school. I'll go Kirk Merritt. Shout out to him. He just got signed to some XFL team. So shout out to Kirk Merritt.
He's on the same team as Reed Sinnott, which is amazing.
The chemistry is going to be amazing. Shout out to both of those guys. Preseason legends. But that is going to wrap it up. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the podcast. Just a little bit of introductory on Anthony Weaver, and then obviously just getting back in the swing of things with the podcast. We're going to try and have these coming out a little bit more consistently, and this is where we get to kind of talk about the big picture stuff when it comes to the Miami Dolphins. And hopefully as time goes on and news comes out, we'll have some more answers to these questions we're asking. But now's the time, and now is the offseason. This is the time to ask these questions, because once the season starts, as we know from this past year, the team is who they are. And unfortunately for us right now, the Dolphins team as they are currently constructed is not a Super Bowl contender. So that's what we're trying to work towards. But thank you guys so much for listening. Please, do all the things that all these content people tell you to do. Rate the podcast, all that stuff. Like it on YouTube, all that sort of stuff. But thank you guys so honestly, all I can ask is that you watch. So thank you guys so much for that. And we'll see you next time.